Hollis Miller had been 36 years upon this earth, and many of them carved deeper lines in him than his age allowed. A widower's weight rested on his shoulders, no children to carry his name, no partner to share the hearth. The cabin was his only companion, its logs darkened with years of storms and seasons. At night, he sat by the fire alone, the chair across from him as empty as the other half of his bed. Those who knew him in town spoke of his size before they spoke of his nature. Giant Miller, they called him. Strong as an ox, hands like hammers. But the truth of him lived not in his strength, but in his silence. He did not go to the saloon, nor court the laughter of neighbors. He kept his words few, and his world smaller still. That evening the air pressed close, heavy with the smell of wood smoke and snow, when a sound broke against the cabin door. It was not the wind, nor the loose rattle of branches. It was deliberate, a knock, sharp, hurried, and trembling. Hollis paused with a log in his arms, his head lifting, every instinct sharpening in the stillness. No one came to his door after dark, not in winter, not without reason. He set the log down slowly, moved to the door, and pulled it open with a cautious hand. There she stood, small as a bird and near as fragile. A girl no more than 7, her hair tangled and damp from snow, her cheeks blotched red with cold. She wore only a thin dress, torn at the hem, her boots so worn the toes peeked out raw. Her eyes were wide, not from the cold but from fear that had settled deeper than the frost. She looked up at him, a giant shadow in the doorway, and whispered words that hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. "They beaten my mama. She's in too much pain." Hollis felt the words strike against the silence of his cabin, echoing in places he thought long closed. For a moment he did not move. The girl's lips trembled, but she did not cry. She had already run out of tears. She stood with a desperate dignity that no child should know, holding herself as though she could keep the world from shattering if she only stood still enough. "Who is your mama, child?" Hollis asked at last, his voice low, like the rumble of earth before a storm. She swallowed hard, her throat small and thin beneath the dirt smudged across her skin. "Mary Ellen. Mary Ellen Carter. They left her at the shack by Miller's Creek. She can't get up. Please, sir, please help her. Mary Ellen Carter." The name pulled at him like a half-forgotten tune. He had seen her once or twice in town, a woman of soft features dulled by weariness, her eyes always downcast when her husband was near. Elias Carter was his name, broad-shouldered but quick with drink and quicker with his fists. Hollis had watched once as Elias barked at her in the store, his hand too near her face, and she had wilted like grass beneath boot heel. Hollis had turned away, as most men did, not out of cruelty but out of the old Western truth. Another man's home was not yours to trespass upon, even when it was cruel. Yet hearing her name now from the lips of her child pierced him deeper than the winter wind. He crouched low, the boards of the porch creaking under his weight, so that his great height would not frighten the girl. "What's your name, little one?" he asked. "Laura May," she whispered. Hollis saw her eyes glisten, though the tears did not fall. He studied the bruises on her small arms, the way she clutched the torn sleeve of her dress as if it might keep her safe. Something hardened in him then, not anger loud and burning, but a quiet fury that ran deeper, like fire hidden in the roots of a tree. "Get inside," he told her, standing tall again. The girl hesitated, as though unsure if she could trust a man so large, so stern. But when the wind gusted and nearly knocked her sideways, she stepped past him into the warmth. Hollis pulled his coat tighter and strode into the night, his boots breaking a steady trail across the snow. Miller's Creek lay a mile off, through bare cottonwoods that rattled like bones. The cold pressed sharp against his face, but his steps never faltered. He carried no lantern, trusting the pale wash of the moon and his own memory of the land. The shack came into view, a sagging ruin of logs and broken shingles, smoke long gone from its chimney. He pushed the door open, the wood groaning on its rusted hinges. Inside, the air reeked of damp straw and stale whiskey. In the corner, upon a pallet of rags, lay the woman. Mary Ellen. Even in the shadows, her injuries told their story. Her cheek was swollen, purpled, one eye nearly closed. Her lips bore the split of a heavy hand. Her arms showed the marks of rough handling, wrists raw where rope had burned. Yet her gaze, when it lifted to him, was not pleading. It was proud, steady, as though she would rather die on the floor than beg another soul for mercy. Hollis stepped closer, his shadow filling the small room. Mary Ellen's voice came hoarse and thin. "You shouldn't have come. They'll say things. They'll ruin you." He knelt slowly, the floor creaking beneath his weight, and looked into her bruised face. "Let them say," he murmured. He slid his arms beneath her with a tenderness that belied his size, lifting her as though she weighed nothing at all. Her breath caught at the sudden movement, but she did not protest. She closed her eyes, perhaps from shame, perhaps from the strange safety she felt in his grasp. He carried her through the snow, his coat wrapped around her slight frame, her head resting against his chest. The storm seemed to ease its howl as they moved, as though even the winter paused to watch. At the cabin, Laura ran to the door, her small hands clasped tight together. When she saw her mother in Hollis's arms, her face lit with a relief that made her seem years older and years younger all at once. He carried Mary Ellen inside and laid her gently upon his own bed, the only bed in the cabin. She stirred, whispering faintly that she could not take his place, but he hushed her with a quiet shake of his head. Laura climbed onto the bed beside her mother, tucking herself close, her thin body trembling from the day's ordeal. Hollis moved to the hearth, stoking the fire higher, the flames crackling strong. He fetched water, tore cloth, and with rough but careful hands, began to clean Mary Ellen's wounds. She winced, but never cried out. He worked in silence, the kind that spoke more than words ever could. Each gesture said what his lips did not: "You are safe here, and no hand will strike you again." Outside, snow fell heavier, blanketing the prairie in white. Yet within that cabin, a fragile warmth took root. Laura's breathing softened into sleep beside her mother. Mary Ellen's eyes, half closed with weariness, flicked once to Hollis as he sat by the fire, his broad shoulders bent forward, his face lined by both the firelight and something deeper, loneliness, perhaps, or the quiet ache of a man who had carried too much silence. She wanted to speak, to thank him, but the weight of shame held her tongue. Still, for the first time in years, she closed her eyes with a small measure of peace. But peace was a fragile thing in those lands. Already, in the tavern across town, Elias Carter's voice carried loud and bitter, slurring over spilled whiskey. He told anyone who would listen that his wife had been stolen, that Miller had taken her into his bed. He spat Hollis's name with venom, vowing to reclaim what was his, to make the giant bleed for shaming him. Men muttered and nodded, eager for drama, for scandal, for a story to tell through the long winter nights. Back at the cabin, Hollis stood from the fire, looking down upon the sleeping mother and child. Something stirred in him he had not felt in years. Not desire, not yet, but the raw pulse of responsibility, of belonging. He stepped to the window, pulling back the curtain. The prairie stretched dark and endless, the snow lit faintly by the moon. Somewhere out there, he knew, Elias was sharpening his anger. Hollis's jaw tightened. His hand rested against the wood of the window frame, steady as stone. He had made his choice the moment he lifted Mary Ellen from the dirt floor of that shack. Whatever came now, he would not let her fall again. And so, as the wind howled and the fire crackled low, the cabin became more than a shelter from winter. It became a battleground of whispers, a place where one man's silence would stand against another's fury. For outside in the dark, voices already whispered that Miller had brought home another man's wife. And in towns like theirs, such whispers could be sharper than any knife. The firelight hummed low inside the cabin, throwing long shadows against the timber walls, while outside the world was locked in early winter silence. Snow pressed thick along the window panes, turning the prairie into a gray-white sea without end. Within that circle of warmth, three lives now moved carefully around one another, like strangers forced together by fate. Hollis Miller rose before dawn, as always, though the rhythm of his days had shifted. He was no longer tending only cattle and fence lines, but also two fragile souls who had been thrust into his keeping. Mary Ellen lay in his bed, her bruises mottling into deep hues of yellow and green, her body still weak though the fever had broken. She woke to the smell of boiled cornmeal and broth, simple but steady food that Hollis prepared with clumsy hands. He was not a man of kitchens, yet his silence carried into the way he stirred the pot, into the way he set the tin bowl beside her without comment. She would murmur thanks, her voice barely more than a thread, and he would nod once, returning to his place by the hearth as though he feared his presence might overwhelm her. Laura May, ever watchful, clung close to her mother, her small hand always seeking Mary Ellen's even in sleep. But slowly, as the days stretched, the child's eyes began to wander toward Hollis. She watched the way his giant hands split wood, the way his boots thudded against the floor, the way his shoulders seemed broad enough to shield the cabin from the storm itself. In her heart a quiet trust was forming, not spoken but lived in the way she dared to smile when he offered her a carved wooden figure, a little horse whittled in the evening silence. She held it tight as though it were gold, whispering it to sleep beside her on the pallet near the fire. Mary Ellen noticed these small things, though she did not let her gaze linger long. Shame pressed heavy upon her, heavier than the bruises Elias had left. To be in another man's home, to be under his care, meant whispers would be born in town before the week was out. She knew the way of gossip. She had heard the cluck of tongues even before the blows began, women muttering of her husband's temper, of her weakness in never leaving him. Now those same mouths would shape sharper words. Fallen woman, shameless, unfit. The knowledge settled on her like frost. Hollis felt the weight too. Each time he hitched his wagon to haul hay or rode into town for supplies, eyes followed him. Men in the saloon spoke low, though not so low he could not hear. Women paused their sewing on porches, their glances sliding like knives across his back. He said nothing. He had lived with silence long enough to let it armor him. Yet inside, when he returned to the cabin, the air seemed softer, filled with Laura's laughter as she tried on his hat or Mary Ellen's quiet hum as she stirred broth. Those sounds carved through his solitude in ways no gossip could undo. One morning the church bell tolled across the frozen plain, summoning the faithful. Hollis hitched his wagon, deciding the child deserved the warmth of prayer and the woman deserved to feel the world again, even if it judged her. Mary Ellen resisted, clutching Laura's hand. "They will stare," she whispered. Hollis met her gaze, his dark eyes steady. "Let them." And so she dressed in her plainest shawl, hiding the worst of her healing face, and climbed into the wagon with her daughter pressed close. The church was small, wood-worn smooth by years of weather, its windows frosted white. Inside, warmth from the stove met the chill of suspicion. Conversations faltered as Hollis led Mary Ellen to a pew near the back. Children peeked over shoulders, their mothers tugging them away with whispers. Reverend Hodge, old and grave, lifted his sermon, but his eyes lingered a beat too long upon Mary Ellen, as though weighing her presence. She bowed her head, cheeks burning. Laura fidgeted, looking to Hollis for comfort. He rested one large hand on her shoulder, stilling her with the simple weight of his presence. After service, Mrs. Prudence Calloway, ever the sharp tongue, cornered Mary Ellen at the steps. "My dear," she said with a smile too sweet to be kind, "it must be hard to endure such trials, but perhaps it would be more fitting if you stayed with kin. Folks are talking, you know." Mary Ellen, already trembling, found her voice falter. Hollis's shadow fell across them, his gaze heavy upon Prudence. Without a word, he stepped closer, his silence sharper than any rebuke. Prudence's smile faltered. She muttered something about prayer and scurried off, her skirts brushing snow. That night Mary Ellen sat by the fire, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I've brought ruin upon you," she whispered. "They'll never forgive this." Hollis looked up from the wood he was carving. His voice came slow, steady. "It isn't forgiveness I'm after. It's peace." Her breath caught, for no man had spoken to her that way in years. Not as something broken, not as something owned, but as someone worthy of peace. She turned away quickly, hiding the flush of warmth that crept into her face. Days folded into one another, marked by snowfalls and the crackle of firewood. Mary Ellen began to regain her strength, rising from bed to sweep the floor, to mend Hollis's worn shirts with careful stitches. She moved slowly, but with purpose, her presence filling the cabin not as burden but as life. Hollis found himself pausing in his chores, listening to her soft humming as she worked, a sound that seemed to knit the cabin walls tighter. Yet the outside world grew sharper. In the saloon Elias Carter's voice rang loud, his pride stung deeper than his fists had ever struck. He spat that Miller had stolen his wife, that she belonged to him, that no giant could hide her away. Men laughed, some mocking Elias, others feeding his fury. He drank deeper, promising that he would ride out, gather men if need be, and drag her back by her hair if that was what it took. The sheriff, weary, warned him to keep peace, but Elias only sneered. News of these words reached Mary Ellen through whispers in the store. She returned to the cabin pale and shaken. "He'll come for me," she told Hollis, her hands trembling as she tried to untie her bonnet. "He'll never stop." Hollis set aside his work, his jaw hard. "Let him come," he said simply. His words carried no boast, no anger, only a certainty that made her heart quiver. For the first time she believed Elias might indeed be stopped, though the thought brought both relief and terror. Laura, sensing the storm, clung tighter to Hollis. One night she crept from her pallet to where he sat carving by the fire. "You won't let him hurt Mama again, will you?" she whispered. Hollis lifted her into his lap, his great hands holding her gently. "Not while I draw breath," he said. The child pressed her head against his chest, listening to the deep, steady beat of his heart. She fell asleep there, safe at last. Mary Ellen watched from the bed, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She had once believed all men carried violence in their hands. But here was one who carried a child as though she were glass, who tended bruises with reverence, who bore shame in silence rather than let it fall on those weaker than him. Something fragile and dangerous stirred within her, a hope she had buried years ago. But hope was a fire that drew shadows. One evening, as Hollis returned from town with supplies, he found a note nailed to his door. The words scrawled crude and angry, "She's mine. Bring her out, or I'll bring men to take her." Hollis tore the note down, crumpling it in his fist. He looked into the cabin where Mary Ellen stirred soup, where Laura played with the wooden horse upon the floor, and he felt the line of his life shift. He could no longer pretend this was only shelter, only kindness. The world had chosen sides, and by opening his door to the broken, he had declared his. As snow thickened outside, the cabin glowed with firelight, fragile and warm. Yet beneath that warmth a reckoning drew near, carried on the hooves of a man who would not rest until his pride was fed. And in the silence before sleep, Mary Ellen whispered into the dark, half to herself, half to the man who sat unmoving in his chair, "You'll lose everything for me." Hollis did not answer. He only stared into the fire, his jaw set, his eyes reflecting the flames. The wind rose outside, rattling the shutters, as though the land itself braced for what was coming. The storm announced itself first with a low moan across the prairie, a sound that carried in the distance like the warning of a great animal stirring from slumber. Hollis Miller felt it before the sky broke, an ache in his bones, a pressure behind the stillness that made the cattle restless in the far pasture. The air turned sharp, laced with a scent of iron and snow, and the horizon thickened with a black weight rolling steadily closer. He worked quickly to secure the barn doors, the rope taut beneath his hands, his breath fogging in the deepening cold. Behind him, the cabin stood against the gray like a solitary sentinel, its windows already glowing faintly with firelight, the only warmth for miles in any direction. Inside, Mary Ellen moved with quiet urgency, gathering cloth from the line, shuttering windows, tucking what food they had into covered bins as if preparing not just for weather but for siege. Her hands trembled at times, though she forced them steady. Laura May followed at her skirts, clutching the carved wooden horse that had become her constant talisman. Each crack of wind outside made the child press closer, her wide eyes watching her mother's face for cues of safety. Mary Ellen, bruises faded but spirit still tender, tried to mask her fear, but the child saw more than she ever said. By dusk the first lash of wind struck, rattling the cabin timbers and sending snow in slanted sheets across the land. Hollis entered, carrying with him the bite of frost, his shoulders dusted in white. He shut the door hard against the gale and stood for a moment, listening. The storm's voice was a deep howl, circling the cabin, seeping through every crack and crevice. He turned then, his gaze sweeping to the two souls by the fire. Mary Ellen met his eyes, a question unspoken. He gave a slow nod, not reassurance, but acknowledgment that the storm outside was not the only one they must face. For word had reached him in town earlier that day. Elias Carter, fueled by drink and wounded pride, had sworn before a circle of men that he would reclaim his wife. He spat venom into every glass, boasting that he would not come alone but with others who carried his bitterness, men glad to fan the fire of scandal into flame. Hollis had not answered the talk, but his silence had not been mistaken for fear. Those who saw the set of his jaw, the stillness in his eyes, knew the giant rancher was bracing for a reckoning. Now, as the storm thickened, Mary Ellen sensed the weight upon him. She stood by the fire, her shawl pulled tight, her face lit by the flicker of flame. "Do you think he will come in this weather?" she asked softly, though her voice carried no hope, only dread. Hollis looked toward the window where snow whirled like ghosts against the glass. "If a man's rage is hot enough," he said, "even the storm won't cool it." She turned away, her hand brushing her daughter's hair. For so long she had endured Elias's wrath, bending beneath it, surviving but never resisting. Now the thought of him returning with others at his back made her stomach knot. Yet there was also something else, an ember of defiance sparked by the sight of her child sleeping warm by a fire, by the knowledge that her pain no longer went unseen. Hollis had lifted her from the dirt, not with pity, but with a kind of strength that carried no expectation but protection. That ember glowed brighter each day, and though fear pressed heavy now, it did not snuff out entirely. The hours stretched long. Hollis moved from door to window, checking latches, tightening shutters, every movement steady and measured. Laura drowsed against her mother's lap, her small breaths soft against the storm's roar. Mary Ellen watched the giant man by the door, the way he seemed carved from the same timber as the cabin itself, unyielding, enduring. She wondered what weight he carried in his silence, what grief hollowed his eyes when the firelight caught them. She longed to ask, yet words failed her. Instead, she whispered to him under her breath, a fragment of comfort from her childhood, the note soft but steady. Hollis paused at the door, listening. For the first time in years, a sound touched the emptiness within him, a reminder that homes were not built of logs alone but of voices that filled the spaces between storms. But the night did not belong to peace. Near midnight, over the howl of wind, came another sound, faint at first, then clearer. Hoofbeats. The crunch of horses through snow, deliberate, drawing closer. Hollis froze, his hand resting upon the rifle propped against the wall. Mary Ellen's breath caught, her fingers tightening around Laura. The child stirred, murmured, and clutched the wooden horse tighter. "They're here," Mary Ellen whispered, fear cracking her voice. Hollis did not answer. He moved to the window, peering through a gap in the shutter. Against the swirl of snow, shadows shifted, mounted figures pushing hard against the storm. He counted 3, perhaps 4, their lanterns swaying like will-o'-the-wisps. One voice cut above the wind, loud, angry, slurred, the voice of Elias Carter. Hollis stepped back, his jaw tight, his face carved in stone. He turned to Mary Ellen. "Get her into the back room," he said quietly. "Do not open that door unless you hear my voice." She hesitated, wanting to protest, but the weight in his gaze left no room. She gathered Laura quickly, whispering comfort though her own fear quaked, and pulled the child into the small back room where blankets were piled high. The door closed softly behind them. Hollis remained in the main room, the rifle steady in his hands, though he prayed it would not be needed. The storm rattled the walls, but above it came the pounding of fists against the cabin door. "Miller," Elias roared. "You think you can steal what's mine? Bring her out, or we'll drag her ourselves." Laughter followed, cruel and mocking, though it held a tremor of men seeking courage against the storm and the man inside. Hollis said nothing. Silence was his answer, the same silence that had carried him through loss, through years of loneliness, through every whisper of gossip. He set the rifle against the wall and reached instead for the lantern. He lit it, the flame casting his great shadow across the room, and then he unbarred the door. Snow burst inward, wind howling, but Hollis stood firm, the lantern raised. The men flinched at the sudden light, their faces raw from cold, their eyes red-rimmed with drink and rage. Elias sat astride a horse, his figure bloated with fury, his mouth twisted. "You've shamed me, Miller," he spat. "You've taken my wife, poisoned her against me. I'll see you ruined before this night ends." Hollis stepped forward onto the porch, the storm clawing at his coat, the lantern in his hand casting long shadows. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, carrying even through the gale. "She was never yours to break. The words struck harder than any fist. Elias's face contorted, rage boiling over. He spurred his horse forward, shouting to the others, "Drag her out!" Hollis set the lantern down in the snow, freeing his hands, his body poised. The storm whipped around them, snow stinging like knives, the night alive with fury. Inside the back room, Mary Ellen clutched Laura close, hearing the muffled shouts, the crash of boots against snow. Her heart hammered, torn between terror and a strange surge of strength. For years she had prayed only to endure. Now, with Hollis standing between her and the storm, she prayed not just for safety but for the courage to never return to chains. Laura whispered against her, her small voice trembling, "He won't let them take you, Mama." Outside, the first of Elias's men dismounted, stumbling through snow toward the porch. Hollis met him, his great frame a wall against the storm, and the clash of bodies rang sharp against the night. Fists swung, boots slid, snow scattered. Hollis moved with the power of a man who had labored all his life, each blow precise, each step unshaken. Another man came, and another, but still he did not falter. The storm howled louder, as if the land itself bore witness. Elias shouted curses, circling on his horse, his face twisted in fury as his men faltered. He screamed Miller's name into the night, but Hollis's silence was answer enough. The fight raged at the edge of the porch, the lantern light flickering wildly, until at last the men staggered back, bruised, bloodied, their rage cooled by the storm and the unyielding force of one man's defense. But Elias remained, his pride greater than his fear. He dismounted at last, stumbling forward, snow clinging to his hair and beard, his fists clenched. "This ain't over," he hissed, his voice sharp with madness. "You think you can take her? You think you can shame me? I'll burn this place to the ground before I let her stay." Hollis stood in the snow, his chest heaving, his face lit by the lantern's glow. His silence now held the weight of a vow, his body poised not just to fight but to endure whatever storm Elias carried with him. The snow fell heavier still, cloaking the land in white, muffling sound, turning the world into a frozen stage for the reckoning yet to come. And from the back room, Mary Ellen pressed her hand to the door, her breath trembling, her eyes wet with both fear and resolve. She had thought herself broken, powerless. But hearing Elias's threats, seeing Hollis's quiet defiance, something within her rose fierce and steady. She knew, with a certainty as sharp as the winter wind, that the next time she faced Elias, she would not face him in silence. The night held its breath then, the storm raging, the men faltering, Elias and Hollis locked in a standoff of will. The lantern flame flickered, snow hissed against the ground, and the prairie itself seemed to pause, waiting for the blow that would shatter the fragile balance. Snow swirled like torn silk across the prairie, and the lantern flame at Hollis Miller's feet bent low under the gale, painting light against the storm's furious canvas. Elias Carter stood before him, his face twisted with rage, the storm's claws lashing his coat. The beaten men who had come at Elias's side lingered farther back, their courage already spent, but Elias's pride burned hotter than the cold, and he advanced with fists tight, his boots crunching the frozen earth. Hollis met him in silence, the breadth of his shoulders squared, his breath a steady fog. The cabin door behind him was shut tight, protecting Mary Ellen and Laura within. He felt their nearness like a flame at his back, fragile yet unyielding, and it gave weight to the moment. Elias sneered through cracked lips, his voice breaking into the wind. "You think you've won because you swung your fists and dropped my men? You think she belongs to you now? She's mine. She always will be." Hollis's reply came low, not loud, not cruel, but with the gravity of a man who had carried silence longer than most men lived. "She belongs to no man. She belongs to herself." The words struck harder than snow against skin. Elias staggered at the thought, then surged with renewed fury, his fist swinging wild. Hollis caught the blow on his arm, the force jolting through him but not breaking him. He countered, a heavy strike that sent Elias stumbling back into the drift, snow exploding around his form. Yet still he rose, mad with wounded pride, lunging again and again. Their struggle became a dance in the storm, Elias flailing with the recklessness of a man who feared being small, Hollis moving with the precision of one who bore responsibility greater than his own life. Each blow landed with the weight of more than fists. Hollis saw in Elias every cruelty carved into Mary Ellen's skin, Every night Laura had gone to bed hungry, every humiliation endured in silence. And Elias, in striking Hollis, sought not only to reclaim a wife, but to prove himself unbroken, to claw back respect from a town that had begun to turn its head. They grappled, boots sliding, fists pounding, the lantern light swinging wildly, casting shadows that leapt monstrous across the snow. Hollis's strength held steady, but Elias fought like a cornered beast. At last Hollis caught him by the collar, his massive hand closing around the cloth, and slammed him against the porch post. The wood shuddered, snow tumbling from the roof. Elias gasped, blood streaking his lip, his eyes burning with hatred. "Do it," Elias hissed. "Break me. Kill me. That's what they'll expect from the giant. That's all you are." Hollis's fist hovered, the storm raging around them, the temptation of vengeance burning hot. But then, faint through the howl, he heard another sound, Laura's voice, muffled by the cabin walls. A child's cry, calling softly, "Mama, is he gone?" That small voice pierced deeper than Elias's taunts. Hollis's breath steadied. He lowered his fist, though his grip remained strong. Killing Elias would only birth another ghost to haunt Mary Ellen and her daughter. Justice was not blood upon snow, it was dignity returned. He yanked Elias forward and flung him down into the drift. Elias scrambled, cursing, but Hollis pressed the rifle barrel, never fired, against his chest, forcing him still. "You'll answer for what you've done," Hollis said, his voice carrying into the night like a vow. "Not here. Not by my hand. By the law." The other men shifted uneasily. None dared step forward, their loyalty frayed by the storm, and the sight of their leader brought low. Hollis dragged Elias up, gripping him like a sack of grain, and half carried, half drove him toward his horse. Elias struggled weakly, spitting blood, but Hollis's silence broke him more surely than any blow. The men mounted without a word, cowed by the giant's resolve. At the edge of the yard, Hollis thrust Elias into the saddle with a force that left him hanging limp. "Tell the sheriff I'll be bringing him by at dawn," Hollis said. "And if you return here again, you'll find no storm strong enough to hide you." The men hesitated, then spurred their horses, dragging Elias with them into the whirling dark. Hoofbeats faded, swallowed by the wind. Hollis stood a long moment in the snow, chest rising and falling, the storm easing its fury as though satisfied. At last he turned and stepped back inside. Warmth met him, the firelight gentle after the cold. Mary Ellen stood near the hearth, her shawl drawn close, her face pale but her eyes fierce. Laura clung to her skirts, her small wooden horse pressed tight in her hand. When Hollis shut the door, the cabin seemed to exhale, as if the walls themselves had held their breath. Mary Ellen's voice trembled, though not with weakness. "You could have killed him." Hollis met her gaze, steady as stone. "A man like that wants you to. Wants to make you small as he is. He won't break me, and he won't break you again." Her eyes glistened, the fire painting them with gold. For the first time in years, she let herself believe those words. Laura broke the silence then, running forward, pressing her little body against Hollis's leg. "You saved us," she whispered, her voice muffled against him. He bent, lifting her gently into his arms. She curled into his chest as though it were the safest place on earth. Mary Ellen watched, her hand rising to her mouth, not to hide shame this time, but to stifle the sob of relief that threatened to break free. Her life had been nothing but survival, but tonight, within these walls, she glimpsed something she had thought forever lost. Shelter not of wood, but of trust. They sat by the fire as the storm softened, the world outside blanketed in white silence. Hollis tended the flames, his broad hands steady. Mary Ellen reached for Laura, but the child had already drifted to sleep in Hollis's arms, her small fingers curled in the fabric of his coat. He did not move her, only looked down, the lines of his face softened by the glow. Mary Ellen's heart tightened, a mixture of gratitude and fear. To hope again was the bravest and most dangerous act of all. Hours passed, the storm dying to a hush. Hollis at last laid Laura on her pallet, tucking the blanket around her. He stood then, facing Mary Ellen across the firelight. No words were spoken, yet in the silence something shifted. She saw not only the man who had fought Elias, but the man who had chosen restraint, who had borne shame so she might be free of it. His silence, once heavy, now seemed a kind of vow. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "I am not his anymore." Hollis's jaw tightened, but he gave no answer. He did not need to. His very presence was answer enough. The fire crackled, the only sound in the small room, as outside dawn began to brush faint silver against the snow. The storm had passed, but in its wake something new remained. Within that cabin, 3 lives, once broken and scattered, had begun to root themselves together in the ashes of firelight and fury. And yet, even in the warmth, shadows lingered. For Elias's threats were not gone, only delayed, carried into town with his bruised pride. Justice would demand its price, and tongues would wag sharper than ever. Hollis knew it, Mary Ellen feared it, and Laura, in her innocence, only trusted the man who had carried her mother from the dirt. The fire burned low, dawn pressing against the shutters, when Hollis finally spoke again, his voice low as the earth itself. "This is only the beginning." Mary Ellen's breath caught at the truth in his words. Her hand trembled as she drew Laura closer, her eyes meeting his across the fading firelight. Something unspoken passed between them, fragile as glass, strong as stone. The storm outside had ended, but the reckoning had only just begun.